In most countries around the world, hazard communications is spreading. Compliance to government regulations is one thing, but safety of people is really the primary goal of hazard communications. Canada and the United States are setting the standard for chemical and hazardous material safety. Now there are many other countries which only a few years ago did not pay much attention to chemical safety, but are now developing similar programs. HazCom standards have been around for a while, and most organizations are diligent in their training and compliance programs. This program is designed to provide the most updated information about HazCom and perhaps identify some of the areas where more work needs to be accomplished. The term Right to Know explains the purpose of the Hazard Communications Program. This right to know information is about chemicals, how they can harm you, and what you should do to keep from experiencing injuries and illnesses related to chemicals and hazardous materials. It's an organizational responsibility, but as with every safety program, each person has an individual responsibility. Individual responsibility in following your organization's policies and procedures and thinking about safety on every task you perform. Let's take a look at the elements of an effective HazCom program. A written HazCom program includes many elements. Each is extremely important because it's your company's guide to the entire chemical safety program. There must be written policies and procedures relating to all aspects of chemicals and hazardous materials. Your written plan may be somewhat different and more detailed, but basically a good written HazCom program contains the following elements. Specific rules relating to the purchase of chemicals is required. This provides a control on the acquisition of hazardous chemicals to assure inventories are commensurate with normal consumption rates and stocks are not stored beyond their usable or safe shelf life. The purchasing procedure should include a current inventory of all chemicals, storage regulations, and disposable procedures. The purchasing department should ensure that all chemicals purchased are provided with MSDSs and assist in obtaining MSDSs when not supplied with chemicals. In some organizations, the purchasing department is responsible for developing a proper storage plan, even though the warehousing department would actually carry out the plan. The storage plan should include proper storage according to their classifications to keep incompatible materials separated. Flammables, oxidizers, corrosives, and toxics should be stored in separate locations. Acids and bases are both corrosive, but react violently when mixed together. Smaller quantities of flammable and combustible materials should be stored in approved flammable storage cabinets. Supervisors and managers are responsible for all hazardous chemicals used within their area of operation. This includes hazardous chemical handling, labeling, storage, transportation, and disposal. A chemical inventory must be maintained. MSDSs must be on hand and readily accessible to all employees. Personal protective equipment and engineering controls must be available and used. Department-level training should be conducted and documented. Hands-on instruction is particularly valuable at the department level. The supervisor should ensure that all accidents, incidents, or exposures involving hazardous chemicals are reported to the HazCom coordinator and respective chains of command as required. Hazard Communications Coordinator is the person responsible for coordinating the program. Note we said coordinate. Supervisors and managers are responsible for implementing and maintaining the program. Duties of the coordinator may include providing technical assistance and advice to supervisors and employees regarding the safe chemical handling, storage, and disposal practices. The coordinator may provide training and information for new employees. Duties also include the compilation and maintenance of a master hazardous chemical inventory, which is up to date and current. The coordinator maintains a library of chemical health and safety information and maintains a master MSDS file for chemicals on the inventory. The coordinator reviews and updates the written program as necessary. Many organizations assign the responsibility of training new employees to the HR department. In such cases, procedures for training new employees in hazard communications must be developed and coordinated by the responsible HR or other department. Manufacturers are required to label all hazardous materials with the following items: name and address of the responsible party, identity of the hazardous chemicals, appropriate hazard warnings. MSDSs should be used to verify the information on labels. Labels should not be defaced or removed as long as the container holds material. Repacking or transferring to smaller containers require the new containers to be properly labeled. In this section of the written plan, persons responsible for ensuring labeling of in-plant containers must be identified. Include persons responsible for ensuring labels on shipped containers. The labeling system used must be described in the written plan. There must be a written plan relating to alternatives to labeling of in-plant containers if your organization is using a different labeling system. There must be written procedures for reviewing and updating label information when necessary. This section covers how the material safety data sheet requirements are being met and to make sure you have an MSDS on every chemical in your facility, which is available to all employees. The plan must designate in writing the persons responsible for obtaining and maintaining the material safety data sheets. Included in the procedures are how the data sheets are to be maintained, such as in notebooks, electronically, or if you have different work sites where the MSDS will be stored. There must be procedures on how to retrieve the MSDS electronically and how employees can obtain access to the MSDSs. The written plan must contain procedures to follow when the MSDS is not received at the time of the first shipment and how to obtain the missing MSDS. The written plan must contain detailed information on training and includes written designation of the persons responsible for conducting training. The plan requires that the format of the training be listed, such as workshops, seminars, videos, or other formats. All of the elements of a training program should be listed in the written plan. Procedures must be developed to make sure new employees are trained. Experienced employees receive periodic and updated training as necessary. Employees must be trained when a new hazard is introduced into the workplace. Proper documentation includes who was trained, how they were trained, what information was taught, and verification that the student learned the information that was taught. Written methods to ensure employees are informed of hazards of non-routine tasks and such information as unlabeled piping. There must be written policies and procedures to ensure that anyone working on your site, such as subcontractors or service representatives, are informed of any hazardous materials to which they may be exposed and provide them with appropriate MSDS. Your written program should also explain the procedures if subcontractors come on your site for work and they bring chemicals or hazardous materials with them. They should provide you with their written HAZCOM plan and documentation as well. You're beginning to see this written plan requirement may take some time and effort. Keep in mind, it's the company's guide to your hazard communications program and should be as detailed as possible. The plan should include a list of the hazardous chemicals in your facility and procedures for multi-employer work sites. The written program must be made available to employees and their designated representatives upon request. Policies, procedures, rules, methods, safety, and other information must be included in the written HAZCOM plan. Another important part of the written plan is emergencies. If employees are not properly trained to react to emergency spills, how can you expect them to react to spills, leaks, and other emergencies? Safety procedures are required for different types of chemicals. Location and types of cleaning supply is required, PPE requirements, and other information. Written procedures should also include alarm systems, rescue information, and evacuation procedures. Specific procedures for first aid treatment of overexposure to chemicals are part of the plan. Basically, all information and procedures that are needed by employees in all aspects of handling, storing, using, transporting, and disposing of hazardous chemicals and what to do in case of an emergency should be included in the written HAZCOM plan. Nothing should be left to chance. Waste minimization and substitution of chemicals for less hazardous chemicals should also be part of the written plan. This is not necessarily a requirement of the HAZCOM standard, but it makes sense to add additional topics to written policies that relate to chemicals and hazardous materials. Certain chemicals, due to their physical properties, exhibit physical hazards, including flammability, reactivity, and other properties. Physical hazard chemicals fall in the following classes: flammable liquids or solids, combustible liquids, explosives, organic peroxide, oxidizers, pyrophoric materials. These are materials that may ignite spontaneously in air at temperatures above 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Unstable materials, water-reactive materials. Health hazard chemicals are those that may cause acute or chronic health effects after exposure. It can be an obvious effect, such as immediate death from inhaling a deadly chemical. A health hazard may not necessarily cause immediate or obvious harm to you, or even make you sick. In fact, you may not see, feel, or smell the danger. An acute health effect usually occurs rapidly, following a brief exposure. A chronic health effect is long, continuous, and follows repeated long-term exposure. As an example of what kinds of chemicals cause health hazards, the list includes carcinogens or cancer-causing chemicals. An example could be formaldehyde or benzene. Toxic agents could include lawn or garden insecticides. Irritants may include chemicals such as ammonia or bleach. Corrosives are caustic sodas or battery acid. That's not the entire list, but it provides an idea of different types and kinds of chemicals. If you're experienced, you should know quite a bit about MSDS, or Material Data Sheets. MSDSs are factual information sheets that relate to chemicals. The manufacturer is required to provide the required information, and each employer is required to maintain these MSDS on file. Anyone who uses the chemical may then ask to see the MSDS to determine information that may not be provided on the labels. The employer may have all the MSDS information on an electronic database. The primary requirement is the MSDS must be readily accessible. If the company uses computers, a printer should be available to provide employees with a hard copy from which to read the information, particularly in a medical or emergency situation. Transmission of the MSDS information orally by telephone is not acceptable. To be realistic, the information on the MSDS is technical in nature, which may or may not be useful to users of the chemicals. Much of the MSDS information is used by engineers, safety managers, and others to determine the actual hazard of the chemical and develop policies and procedures for the safe use, handling, storing, and disposing of the chemical. The MSDS also provides information on what type of personal protective equipment is necessary and first aid procedures to take in case of exposure. When training employees in MSDS, it is not sufficient just to have them read the information on the MSDS. Training must be provided, and it must be delivered in the language spoken by the employee. Documentation of the employee understanding the training is also required. Some organizations have trade secrets, so they don't want too much chemical information exposed on MSDS. Even if a chemical is a claimed trade secret, the following minimum information is required on the MSDS. The PEL, or permissible exposure limit, and the TLV, or the threshold limit value, or other designated limits must be listed. Containers of hazardous chemicals must be labeled in English. Generally, where there are non-English speaking personnel, the label should be in that language or languages also. Labels must contain the following information: identity of the hazardous chemical, appropriate hazard warnings, name and address of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. You may use signs, placards, symbols, batch tickets, or printed operating procedures in place of labels on individual containers, as long as the meaning is fully understood by the people using the chemicals. Where the chemical is intended only for the use of the employee making the chemical transfer, labels may not be required. This means the container must be used only by that person and must be used only during the work shift. If the container is to be used on another shift or by another person, then a label is required. Some common labeling terms include combustible, flammable, corrosive, irritating, and toxic. There are several systems and standards for labeling chemicals, but there is not a uniformly accepted system to date. Each system and standard has advantages and limitations. The ANSI, or American National Standards Institute, Z129.1, has a precautionary label containing the name of the chemical, a signal word, such as warning or danger, and the key hazard, such as flammable or vapor harmful. A statement of precautions to avoid the hazard is also included. NFPA 704 is another labeling system, which is a color-coded system. It uses a color-coded diamond with 4 quadrants, in which numbers are used in the upper 3 quadrants to signal the degree of emergency health hazard, which is blue, the fire hazard, which is red, and the reactivity hazard, color-coded yellow. The bottom quadrant is used to indicate water reactivity, radioactivity, biohazards, and other special hazards. The emergency hazards are based upon a numerical scale of 0 to 4, 0 having no unusual hazard, 1 equates to a minor hazard, 2 as moderate, 3 as severe hazard, and a 4 rating is an extreme hazard. The NFPA diamond is used primarily by emergency response personnel and does not adequately signal occupational hazards. The NFPA system is good for alerting personnel to the degree of hazard of the chemical and is helpful in drawing attention to storage needs and emergency equipment requirements. The DOT, or Department of Transportation labeling system, uses a color-coded diamond where there is a symbol and a term describing the major hazard of the material. The DOT system is used for the transportation of hazardous materials. HMIS, or Hazardous Materials Information System, is one of the most popular systems for labeling containers. It uses standard labels to communicate hazards through the use of colors, numbers, and letters of the alphabet and symbols. For as long as the HAZCOM standard has been in existence, there is still some doubt or misunderstanding of what training, documentation, and information is required for the Hazard Communications Program. First, employees must be trained at the time of your initial employment or assignment and whenever a new hazard is introduced into the workplace. Employees should be trained and made aware of what is required by the HAZCOM standard, such as labels, MSDS, the written program, potential hazards, and other general information. One thing that should be taught and fully understood by employees is that mixing chemicals without proper training and authorization is very hazardous. If you get the wrong mix of chemicals, you could be changing the physical or health characteristics. You could take two chemicals that, when used individually, are relatively safe. However, when you mix the two together, you could form a very dangerous or hazardous mixture. Don't mix chemicals unless you've been trained and authorized by your employer. Employees must be informed of any operations in the work area where hazardous chemicals are present. Employees must be informed of the location and availability of the company's written program. Employees must know the location and availability of the MSDS files. The training should include the observations methods used to detect the presence or release of hazardous chemicals in the workplace. What we mean by observation methods is whether there are testing methods, air sampling, or other methods. How do you know if hazardous chemicals are present or if the air is safe to breathe? Employees must be trained in the physical and health hazards of chemicals. Employees exposed to health hazards must be apprised of both changes in body functions and the signs and symptoms that may occur to signal those changes. It is not necessary that the employer provide training on each specific chemical. Training may be conducted by categories of hazards, such as carcinogens, sensitizers, that is or may be encountered by the employee during the course of his or her duties. In the case of temporary employees, the host employer has the responsibility with the temporary agency. A frequently overlooked portion of the training provisions is dealing with emergency procedures. If a chemical were very hazardous, more information would be expected to be provided on the MSDS and emergency procedures. Training should include measures of protection, what action should employees take to control the emergency or not control the emergency, and related information. In situations where employees are expected to moderate or control the impact of the emergency, then additional emergency responder training would be required. In this case, an understanding of what hazardous substances are and the risk associated with them in an incident. An understanding of the potential outcomes associated with an emergency created when hazardous substances are present. Documentation of training is also of great importance. Here is a simple test to see if you're properly documenting training. Go back to training that was conducted 5 years ago and determine the following elements: name of the student, date of training. What specific information was taught? If it were a video or CD interactive, do you still have a copy of the program? If it were a stand-up lecture, the lesson plan should be available for review. Who was the instructor, and what were his or her qualifications to teach the course? Explain how you can tell if the students in this training fully understood what was taught. This can be in the form of written questions and answers or other similar means. This simple test will tell you if you are properly documenting your training. Shipping and receiving chemicals and hazardous materials may be the job of only the shippers and receivers. but it's important for all personnel who use or work with chemicals to understand the process. When receiving chemicals, proper paperwork, such as the bill of lading and other identifying information, must accompany the chemical. The chemical must be properly labeled. An MSDS must be provided for each chemical received. Without proper paperwork, documentation, labeling, and MSDS, the chemical should not be received until such time as it is provided. The same basically applies to a person who uses the chemical. Is it properly labeled? Do you know where the MSDS is located? Are you familiar with this chemical, and if not, where do you go for proper training and assistance? Receiving a chemical is more than just a warehouse receiver unloading it from a truck. Proper procedures apply to everyone. If you're shipping hazardous materials, you really must be properly trained. Let's ask a few questions and see if you know the answer. Can a hazardous material be shipped by the U.S. Postal Service? Can UPS or FedEx ship hazardous materials? How do you ship a can of flammable paint from California to New York? Where do you find the information that provides the guidelines for shipping hazardous materials? Well, how did you do on the quiz? The U.S. Postal Service does not allow hazardous materials to be transported. UPS and FedEx have special programs, but you have to contact them for the specific shipment rules. You can ship a can of flammable paint through an authorized trucking company that is allowed to transport hazardous materials. The rules for shipping hazardous materials is found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR 49, Part 100 to 185. What all this means is there are specific rules and standards for everything that relate to chemicals. You may not be a shipper or receiver of hazardous materials or chemicals, but the point is chemicals and hazardous materials require your attention. It requires you to read and follow the directions and information printed on the labels. It requires you to know and read the material safety data sheet for each chemical you use. If you're not sure about something, be sure and ask your supervisor. Don't take chances when it comes to your health and safety. Exemptions to the labeling requirement include pesticides, food, drugs, cosmetics, distilled spirits, and consumer products labeled in accordance with the Consumer Product Safety Act. These particular chemicals are covered by other standards. Additional products exempted from the Hazardous Communication Standard include hazardous waste, tobacco, wood or wood products, but not wood dust, drugs, food, cosmetics for personal consumption, consumer products used in the same manner and resulting in the same frequency and duration of exposure as a consumer, ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, biological hazards. Let's explain a bit more about the consumer product exemption because these products may actually be used in the workplace. The consumer products exempted are those normally found in supermarkets and other consumer outlets. Examples are bleach, ammonia, cleaners, polish, and other similar products. If you have the same use and exposure as a normal consumer, then these products are exempted under the Hazard Communication Standard. If you're purchasing 100 barrels of bleach, then don't expect that large a quantity of a consumer product to be exempt. The HAZCOM written plan should have specific rules and procedures on personal protective equipment. The company must have an assessment of all hazards in the workplace. After the hazards have been identified or assessed, proper safeguards should be instituted to reduce these hazards. This protection can come in the form of engineering controls or personal protective equipment. Some chemicals may require the use of rubber gloves, safety glasses, face shields, goggles, rubber aprons, and special footwear or even respirators. Whenever the company requires personal protection, then it's up to the individual to wear it. When PPE is required, it's not a choice. It's mandatory to protect the health of the individual who may be exposed to potential health hazards. For persons who are required to wear personal protective equipment, such as respirators, then specific training must be provided. Personal protective equipment is an integral part of any safety program. Certainly it would be much better if all hazards could be eliminated through engineering controls, but that's not realistic. PPE is here to stay, and it takes everyone's effort to wear the proper equipment when it's required. Each day, new chemicals are added to the growing list of chemicals in use throughout the world. New, better, faster acting, more potent chemicals, better for greater living. The one thing we must do is keep up with knowledge and information. The Hazard Communication Standard is helping companies all over the world get greater control of chemical information and to develop methods and training programs to make sure chemicals don't become physical or health hazards. The program is working. More written plans are being developed. Better policies and procedures are entering the workplace, and employees are gaining greater knowledge about chemicals through effective training programs. It's a team effort, and it's worldwide. The Hazard Communication Program is spreading all over the world because there is nothing else more important than human life.